Spend my 20 minutes embarrassing Connie. The reason why you will have so many distinguished people from the world of Canadian cinema here is Connie's work in Canadian cinema for many, many years, longer than I have actually. When I did Canadian Film Reader, I did Canadian Film Reader because I wanted to teach a course in Canadian cinema, because universities were much more conservative in those days. They said, you can't teach a course because there's no book. Nobody has written a book on something, therefore you can't teach a course on it. And I said, all right, well, I'll get a book together. I'll find the best writing on Canadian cinema and we'll make a book. And found a publisher and found all this. And then after I said I was going to do that, I had to find some writing about Canadian cinema. And very quickly I discovered there was a woman in Montreal who was editing a journal called Cinema Canada, and publishing it and writing it. And if nobody else had articles that week, she'd write all of it.
I pay Seth to say this, by the way.
And so was writing and publishing and editing really the first important writings of not only the film critics and scholars of the day, but the filmmakers. And those issues of Cinema Canada are now treasures, because they capture that era of the 1960s, 1970s into the 1980s so beautifully. And that's why you're going to find so many distinguished people from the world of Canadian cinema coming to your series, because they are all very grateful to Connie for having helped give them a voice for their work and for writing about other people's works at that time. So you have a national treasure here. All right, now I've finished embarrassing Connie. I really enjoyed your comments about Mon Oncle Antoine. It was a little bit of an education for me. With such a short time to speak, let me just talk about two aspects of it. I think it is both a universal story and a very particular story to the history of Quebec. And the universal story is, of course, the story of the young man growing up and discovering things about his culture, about himself, about the other people around him, some of which are good, some of which are bad, and beginning to determine how he's going to react to those things. And I think every culture has created stories like that, whether they're oral history stories, whether they're novels, films, plays. The story of the young man growing up, looking at the culture, deciding what is wrong with it, and sometimes changing it. And the young man is sometimes a metaphor for the country itself, that is growing up and looking at itself and deciding what must be changed, and whether or not he can survive in it. And usually, I'm saying young man because that has been, as far as I know, the great majority of these stories. It's only quite recently that we've had stories about young women who grow up and look at their societies and decide that something is wrong and they have to do something about it, or they have to get out. And very often that's the end of the story, when the young person gets out and grows up and decides, and then is looking back at this world. And the world that they're looking back in, I think the other point of those stories is that although they may be writing in a different and more modern and more open world than the one that's in the story, that they may be looking back at that world from somewhere else, that old world is always inside of them. And we all have, Mon Oncle Antoine, I think, means more than just the character here. I think Mon Oncle Antoine means the old world, the old culture, the culture we left behind, the conservative culture, the conservative part of all of our cultures, the part that we're sometimes nostalgic about, but boy, we sure don't want to go back and live in it. Right? It's just too hard. It's too limiting. It's too difficult. And we might even feel guilty about leaving it behind, but it's not part of our modern lives, and we couldn't do that. So that, I think, is the general story, and that's why I think the film has been so popular in many places, not just Canada, but has been a film that's attracted quite an amount of attention around the world, and did really one of the first Canadian films that's seen as universally accessible, popular, and liked. The specific Quebec story is a very long one, but it's, let me try to summarize it briefly. The culture you see here, the Mon Oncle Antoine culture, was built up over 200 years, from the time the English conquered Quebec in 1759 to the time the film is taking place in probably the late 1940s or early 1950s. And it's a very stable culture, but it's a culture that's made up of a lot of compromises. In the traditional Quebec society was a kind of power was divided between the church, which ruled every bit of people's everyday lives. There was no secular education system, for instance, and the economic wealth of the province was owned largely by English companies and English Canadian companies later on, and the political power of the province was in the hands of usually rather dictatorial people who managed to work their way between the economic and the church powers, and who there was very little tolerance for dissent. There was essentially a one-party system. And when you see Jean Poulin going to the bathroom early in the film, there's somebody's written Abad Duplessis. Duplessis was the longtime premier of Quebec in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. He finally died in 1959 and began, really the quiet revolution begins with his death because he had such an enormous grip on the province. But the film is set at a time, I think, when they were the first rumblings of that revolution. It's significant that it's in the asbestos region of Quebec, in northern Quebec, in an isolated town. The first big union protest in Quebec, the first time that I think somebody noted that the Quebec unions got themselves together and began to fight not just the corporations, but the government that behind them, was in the asbestos mining towns, where things had become so bad that it became a grand cause for not just those people, but for everybody in Quebec at the time who wanted any kind of change. There's a very famous picture of the young Pierre Trudeau, who certainly wasn't an asbestos miner. He was the son of a very wealthy family in Montreal, who goes to one of the little mining towns to march with the strikers. And he's wearing a pair of very fashionable Bermuda shorts and looks every bit the downtown Montreal intellectual that he was. But this became one of the first causes for change in Quebec in the late 1940s and early 50s. So that itself would have a meaning to the people who saw this film. That this was, this place, this situation was kind of the worst of the worst. The time that where things got so bad, it had to be turned around. And so you see the young Benoit, who is just looking. I mean, most of this film is punctuated by reaction shots of Benoit's face, right? Who is just looking at these different things going on around him, right up until the famous last shot of it, where he's looking at what is essentially the old culture and what could be his future if he stayed there. There's a boy about his age lying in a coffin with the family lying around it. It's the dead culture. It's the thing that's no longer viable. And he's looking at it precisely through a window. He's facing right on it, but he's also on the other side of the glass. Right? He's looking into it. He's not part of it, but he's looking back at this dead culture, and he's already, outside of it, literally in the snow. And so I think you take that last image, and then you look back around at what's going on in the film. Somebody mentioned the zoom shots, for instance. I think, in a way, the zoom shots, and the film is shot by a man named Michel Brault, who just died a couple of weeks ago. He was one of the great Quebec cinematographers and directors. And Brault, prior to the films being made in 1970, had been one of the people who originated the Uniquely Quebec documentary. And by that I mean he had until the late 1950s, there was very little happening within the National Film Board that is distinctly Quebecois. And the Quebec directors often did Quebec versions of the English films, or they would make films for local consumption that weren't terribly different than the other films. But in the late 50s, when Cinema Verite began, and Brault was one of the first people who knew how to shoot with the new equipment. He was one of the original Cinema Verite cinematographers, so much so that when Jean Rouch made Chronicle of a Summer, which many people see as the birth of Cinema Verite, it literally was, because it was the first film that the term was used about in 1960. He brought Brault over from Canada to shoot most of it, because Brault had been actually working in that style earlier. So Brault, the reason I think you see the zooms and the handheld camera and the camera that looks, that is looking at things, is first because that's what so much of the film is about. Benoit looking at things, Benoit judging things, and the zoom camera invites you to do the same. But at the same time, it's also a quotation of that documentary movement that starts in the late 1950s in Quebec, and begins the national cinema, because for them, the first thing you do, and for many national cinemas, the first thing you do in a national cinema is you look at your own culture and you see what's different about it. What isn't, kind of homogenized worldwide thing. But I once spoke to a Yugoslav film director, and he said, in Serbia now, and he said, we realized we couldn't just shoot other people's scripts in Belgrade. We had to find, a guy who looked uniquely like a Belgrade policeman. We had to find, kinds of restaurants that did things they only did in Belgrade. And that was a big job. And it was a big job in Quebec. And Brault and the early Quebec documentarians in the late 1950s, early 1960s are going around Quebec, and they're making films not just about the rural areas, but what people were interested in the cities. They did a film about wrestling, for instance, and the professional wrestling matches that would happen in Montreal, or about the first day of school in a working class neighborhood in Montreal and what it looked like. Or what it was like to work in a cotton mill, and so they're looking for the unique sights of Quebec. They're looking for the unique sound of the language. As you know, it's a kind of French that they were very happy in some of their films when they sent them to France. They were asked to subtitle them in French because the French audiences couldn't understand Montreal French or rural Quebec French. So this wasn't an insult to them. They just felt now they're finding something that's unique to their country. So the second meaning, I think, then, of that zoom lens, of that handheld camera, is to say this film comes from a tradition of just finding stuff that is unique to us. Right? And the film actually starts that way, in a way, because the man who had made the film about the people working in the cotton mill, Clement Perron, and the film is called Day After Day, Jour Après Jour, had decided he wanted to be a screenwriter. He saw there were more and more fiction films being made, and he wrote a fiction film script. And he approached Claude Jutre, who had already made 2 feature films at that point. And he said, would you read my script and tell me what you think about it? And Jutre read his script and hated it, and because he was friends with Perron, he took him out to lunch. And after a few drinks, Perron started telling him stories about his own childhood up in the asbestos region of Quebec. And Jutre looks at him at one point and says, Clement, why didn't you write this into your script? This is a great film. And so he agreed not only to help him with the script, but to make the film. And they worked together, and Jutre himself, like Pierre Trudeau, had nothing to do with this culture. He was the son of a prominent medical family, and he himself actually had a medical degree. He used to say he didn't practice medicine for humanitarian reasons. And he decided very early on, and after med school, to never be a doctor, but he wanted to be an artist and then a filmmaker, and joined the National Film Board, where he had been working for close to 20 years before he made this film, and he'd done other projects there as well. And so they're coming, he's taking advantage of a moment also in the history of Canadian film, where you go from a very successful documentary movement in the 1950s to more and more interest in making feature films in Canada. And in 1964, the government decided to subsidize the making of feature films, and the actual making of these films started in 1967. Even before that, there were people who were making very, very low budget feature films in Canada. But once this matures during the 1960s, and it does so in the shadow of the French New Wave and all the new waves that are coming up in Europe, and the realization that nations need national cinemas, that people can make films outside of studios, that you don't need to go to Hollywood and use Hollywood plots, that you can take cameras out in the street and make films of the things that interest you. Once this starts to take hold, it seems a very natural thing to do. And so you get a number of people making these little low-budget films all over Canada and in Quebec particularly, some with the help of the National Film Board, many without. And this film really is the next step from that, because many of these films have kind of one foot in the documentary tradition. Canada is very well known for documentary at this time, and many of the people making these films had trained and worked as documentary filmmakers before. What Schuster is doing here, I think, is very consciously taking the documentary tradition and using it for storytelling, and using it to tell this particular tale of this boy looking at this culture and looking at Quebec at this time of his history. So, should I stop there, or is that 20 minutes?
Yeah,
Did I use up my time?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks very much. Let's give a round of applause. Yeah. So, this is the section that you can direct your